independent or community media is essential in Egypt in order to foster change. Traditional media, the state media, the private media that's owned by big businessmen or political parties have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. And so independent media, community media is by its very nature disruptive. Its nature is to disrupt the status quo, especially in Egypt, which has been stagnant politically for so long in terms of the structure of the state, in terms of actual change.
Sharif, can you update us on the developments over the weekend?
Well, Amy, it was another My name is Sharif Abdel Kouddous. I'm an independent journalist based in Cairo. I was born in the United States, but I grew up in Cairo, Egypt. And I began my work in journalism in 2003 with Democracy Now! This came after me being quite politicized by the Second Palestinian Intifada in 2000. I was in New York during 9/11 and witnessed the strong nationalism and anti-Muslim and anti-Arab sentiment that quickly proliferated in much of the mainstream media in the United States. And in 2011, I came to Egypt to cover the uprising, and from there I stayed in Cairo. I work with Democracy Now! Frequently, also with The Nation, and I write for other outlets.
CNN is now saying...
In the United States, media, traditional media, the corporate media, the media that most people associate with news, I believe has a very problematic approach to the way they cover the news. They prioritize the official narrative versus those of dissent and those who are challenging the official narrative. And so especially after 9/11, we saw a lot of the media in the United States and a lot of journalists trade coverage for access. And so instead of asking the tough questions, which would get them on the bad side of government officials, they throw softballs at them in order to get the interview with George Bush or to be able to get access to Dick Cheney. And we saw this failure completely manifest itself in the run-up to the war of Iraq. Papers like the New York Times, they were completely parroting uncontested the Bush administration's claims of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They were not checking these claims, and it failed the American public, and it helped beat the drums for war. And even the New York Times itself and the Washington Post a couple of years later published a mea culpa, admitting their mistakes in helping this war to come to effect. And I think during this time, shows like Democracy Now! And independent media have been growing, and they're based on a different model. And that's a model that doesn't rely on any corporate or government funding. In Egypt, we have a very different, but in many ways similar, problem with large media organizations. The main outlets for news are state media, which acts as a propaganda venue for the state, and large media outlets that are owned by either private businessmen or political parties, which either have a political or financial agenda. So in the run-up to the revolution, we saw the state media completely demonize the uprising, and shamelessly, when Mubarak fell, the state media immediately celebrated the uprising, celebrated the people of Tahrir. And this is because, as Hisham Esem, a publisher here, said, the state media is like a dog that needs a master. And right after Mubarak fell, it was unclear where the power block lay, and it did lie with people on the street, and so they were supporting people on the street. It's a very brief moment until the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces really emerged as the new power center in Egypt, and very quickly again, we saw them parroting the official line, demonizing workers going on strike, vilifying protesters as being paid foreign agents, and completely towing the government line. We can't talk about the revolution in Egypt, we can't talk about the uprising, the vast changes that are taking place in the country without talking about independent media and the effect that it has had. The way it helped popularize a culture of dissent, a culture of protest in Egypt by documenting what was happening in the 10 years leading up to 2011, an increasing number of protests, people protesting the Second Intifada, protesting the invasion of Iraq, the Kafaya movement. All of these things didn't occur in the realm of the traditional media, but were really covered much more by the community and independent media. So it was in this narrative and it was in this period where independent media in Egypt really began to grow and to form itself. And groups like Musireen were founded in Tahrir Square, first as a way to gather and archive all this footage that was being recorded by citizens on their phones with cameras. They would put together videos that documented dissent, that documented protests, that spoke to workers on strike and why they were striking, that did workshops training people how to shoot, how to edit, and that quickly created a network across the country of like-minded revolutionary activists and regular people on the street going into the poorest areas, talking to people about what their grievances are, what they want to see happen, and putting these videos up on YouTube, spreading it around via Facebook and Twitter, and gaining more and more audience. The reality is these are people with very real grievances, and these grievances are not addressed whatsoever by the state and private media. So that's why independent media is this important forum. And because it is disruptive, it has come under severe assault by the state. So we've seen journalists, and not just independent journalists, but all journalists come under attack in an unprecedented way in Egypt. In 2013, Egypt's become the third deadliest place in the world for journalists. It became, for the first time, in the top 10 worst jailers of journalists. What took place in 2011 forever changed the society, and it's going to continue to do so. And that'll certainly, I think, extend to the media as people find new ways to challenge the state narrative. Even if you look at just different forms of expression, like the graffiti movement that has really taken hold in Egypt, using the walls of streets to pay tribute to revolutionary martyrs, to attack the state, to portray violence. This was a very important movement, and one that the state recognized, and you see them constantly trying to white out and paint over graffiti. Whether it's Twitter or Facebook or new types of social media that people are inventing, I think there's no question that there's a generation that is coming up that is using these tools and using them in a very important way to outflank and outmaneuver the state and outmaneuver big business interests. We saw the uprising in 2011 inspire people's movements around the world when people saw what can happen by going down into the streets and calling for change. And so we saw in Spain the Indignados movement, we saw in London university student protests, we saw the Occupy movement in the United States, we saw movements in Greece, in Italy. Whereas governments tend to bring people apart, these kind of social movements through independent media bring people together and they make these connections. So that gives me hope for the future.